Autumn arrived over Britain the way old grief arrives in a quiet house, softly, without announcement, settling into the corners of the world as though it had always belonged there. The trees of the forbidden forest bent beneath a wind that carried the scent of wood smoke and rain, and somewhere beyond the horizon the towers of Hogwarts stood pale against a bruised evening sky. It was the kind of hour when the veil between things felt thin, when even the owls seemed to hesitate before taking flight. Then reality tore. It was not the crack of thunder nor the roar of a spell miscast. It was a sound the forest had never heard before, a hush so absolute it felt like the world itself had forgotten to breathe. A seam of pale light opened between two ancient oaks, and from that seam stepped a man who did not belong to any century the forest remembered. Satoru Gojo landed lightly on the mossy earth, blindfold still in place, coat rippling as though the wind had only just decided to acknowledge him. He tilted his head, listening. The last thing he remembered was the shudder of unstable, cursed energy collapsing inward, the taste of something ancient trying to devour him. And then this, a silence stitched from a different loom entirely. He smiled the way a traveler smiles when the map is finally interesting. The forest recoiled around him without moving. The Strauss lifted their heads in the far dark, nostrils flaring at a scent they could not name. Acromantulas retreated into deeper burrows. A herd of centaurs paused at the crest of a distant ridge, and their leader, Fieranes, felt the stars themselves rearrange their meaning above him. Something had entered the world that the sky had not predicted. Gojo walked without hurry, one hand in his pocket, feeling the strange current of this place brush against his senses. It was magic, but not the kind that clawed its way out of human anguish. This power was older, warmer, threaded into bark and root and river stone. It did not hunger, it remembered. At Hogwarts, the disturbance rippled through the castle like a slow ache. Portraits whispered of a pale man in impossible clothing wandering the trees. The Grey Lady drifted through the astronomy tower and would not speak. Enchantments along the outer wards flickered, trying to catalog what had arrived and failing again and again. Professor McGonagall led the response herself, her tartan cloak snapping in the cold, flanked by Aurors and two members of the Order whose faces were carved from a decade of war. They found him at the tree line, hands raised in polite greeting, and mistook courtesy for menace. Spells came in a bright, murderous arc, red and green and silver, curses that had ended lesser lives without ceremony. Every one of them stopped, not deflecting, not shielded, simply stopped, hanging in the air like insects caught in unseen amber, then dissolving into nothing an inch from his skin. There was no flash of protection, no reactive ward, no counter-incantation. There was only the quiet fact of him standing there untouched, as though the universe itself had drawn a private line around his person and refused to let magic cross it. The Aurors lowered their wands slowly, unable to remember how to breathe. Gojo tilted his head with the faintest amusement. "You know," he said, voice light as autumn air, "everyone here relies far too much on ranged attacks." By morning, the story had run through Diagon Alley like fever. By afternoon, it had reached the whispered corridors of the Ministry. By evening, in a candlelit room far from any map, Lord Voldemort listened to a trembling servant recite the impossible. He did not laugh. He did not scoff. He simply closed his colorless eyes and asked a single, patient question. If magic cannot touch him, then what exactly is he? And somewhere beneath the stars, Gojo walked toward Hogwarts, smiling as though a vacation had just begun. Hogwarts accepted Gojo the way the sea accepts a strange tide, uncertain whether to embrace or resist. Dumbledore met him at the gates without weapons, without wards, only with a small nod that suggested a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by impossible things. The invitation was gentle, almost gracious, and Gojo, curious in a way he had not been in years, followed the old wizard inside. The great hall opened around him like a cathedral of candles. Students rose in slow waves, not out of ceremony but out of instinct, the way animals rise when something enormous walks past their den. He greeted them with a two-fingered wave and a smile that was neither humble nor cruel, only easy, as if all of this were a mildly interesting dream. In the days that followed, Gojo learned the shape of his own limits for the first time in a long while. Wands did not obey him. Runes refused to yield their meanings. When he tried to lift a simple enchanted quill by intent alone, the quill remained where it lay, indifferent to a being who could, in theory, split the sky. This magic did not answer to strength. It answered to lineage, to ritual, to laws written in the marrow of the world. Hermione took it upon herself to unravel him. She haunted the restricted section like a small, determined ghost, pulling down volumes that had not been opened in centuries. There was no record of him, no lineage, no bloodline, no historical parallel. She began to suspect that the archives were not incomplete, only that Gojo had never been anywhere for them to remember. Harry watched him from a different distance. He recognized something in the man's laughter, the practiced ease of someone who had learned to smile because the alternative was unbearable. When they finally spoke, alone by the courtyard fountain, no great truth was exchanged, only a quiet acknowledgement between two people who had been asked. Too young to carry too much. Dumbledore spoke with Gojo often, their conversations winding late into candlelit evenings. They spoke of destiny and choice, of whether a curse and a blessing were merely the same power seen from different sides. Dumbledore listened more than he spoke, and Gojo, who had spent his life being the loudest presence in any room, found himself listening too. The ministry was less kind. Owls arrived bearing summonses stamped in official crimson. Cornelius Fudge's successor, harried and pale, demanded that the stranger submit to formal magical examination, that his aura be measured, his intentions catalogued, his existence licensed. Gojo declined with a politeness so complete it felt almost like insult. He would not be filed away. Whispers began in the older families. In the dim parlors of pure blood estates, portraits murmured of an ancient weapon reawakened, of a dark sorcerer wearing the face of a foreigner, of prophecies half-remembered from books no one had actually read. Fear spread faster than fact, as it always did. Voldemort listened to all of it through eyes that were not his own. He watched Gojo cross a courtyard without disturbing a single fallen leaf. He watched a corridor of enchanted armor bow its helmet slightly as he passed. And he noticed, with the patience of a spider studying a new kind of fly, that certain artifacts confused Gojo. An old locket refused to reveal its secrets to him. A cracked mirror in a forgotten hall showed him nothing. His invincibility was absolute, yet his understanding was not. Hope, thin and cold, entered Voldemort's chest. Perhaps this creature could not be broken by force. Perhaps he could be outthought. That evening, Dumbledore called Gojo into his office and set upon the desk 3 objects retrieved from vaults not opened in 100 years. A ring, a shard of stone, a tarnished coin. Each of them pulsed faintly in rhythm with Gojo's presence, as though they had been waiting for him without knowing his name. Dumbledore looked up, and for the first time his eyes were afraid. They traveled north under a sky the color of old iron. Dumbledore led them across moors that had forgotten the sound of human voices, past standing stones half swallowed by heather, down into a valley where the maps of the wizarding world simply ended. Harry and Hermione walked close together, wands drawn but low, while several professors kept watchful pace behind. Gojo strolled beside them as though on holiday, hands in pockets, the wind refusing to lift a single strand of his hair. The ruins waited beneath the earth. They descended through a stairway carved into living rock, its steps worn smooth by feet that no longer had names. The air grew colder, then warmer, then wrong, as though temperature itself could not decide what to be. Torches lit themselves without invitation. Somewhere far below, water dripped in a rhythm too steady to be natural. Hermione's breath caught when she saw the walls. Runes crawled across them in patterns older than any language she had studied. Spirals within spirals, geometries that made her eyes ache when she looked too long. This was not the magic of Hogwarts. This was the grammar the world had used before Hogwarts was ever dreamed. The first trap came without warning. Not fire, not steel, but perception. The corridor lengthened while they walked it, then folded, then breathed. Harry looked back and saw himself walking ahead of himself. Hermione blinked and forgot for a moment whether she was alive. Gojo, for the first time since arriving in this world, felt something press against infinity, not to break it but to bypass it entirely. Slipping through concepts his technique had never been designed to refuse. He stopped smiling. He did not stop moving. He reached out and caught Harry's shoulder before the boy walked into a wall that pretended to be a door, and in that small gesture something shifted between them. Gojo was not here as a spectacle. He was here as a companion. Hermione deciphered the first inscription by candlelight, her voice trembling as she translated. "The untouchable wanderer," she read, "he who walks between the fractures. His arrival is the pivot. The world shall steady where the world shall break." Silence followed. Even Dumbledore, whose composure had survived a century of horrors, briefly closed his eyes. Then the ambush came. Death Eaters poured from side chambers, masked, silent, sent to end Harry, while the wizarding world's strangest guest was distracted by riddles. Green light lit the ancient walls. Screams echoed against carvings that had never heard human pain. Gojo moved. He did not raise the chamber. He did not level the ruins. He threaded himself between the attackers with a precision that felt almost gentle, redirecting curses into stone rather than flesh, disarming 3 at once with a single lazy sweep, catching a killing curse in midair and simply letting it evaporate against the boundary no spell had ever crossed. He fought as though every ancient carving mattered, as though the past itself was watching, and he refused to be the one who broke it. When it was over, the survivors of the Death Eater strike had fled or fallen, and the ruins stood undamaged. Hermione stared at him with something that was no longer fear. Harry stared with something that was almost hope. Then the deepest chamber woke. A voice spoke without sound, pressed directly into the marrow of every mind present. It was not cruel. It was not kind. It was old in the way galaxies are old, and it turned its attention upon Gojo with the slow certainty of something that had been waiting for a very long time. It called him by a name. Not Satoru, not Gojo. A name in a language none of them knew, syllables that felt like keys turning in locks buried in his ribs. He stiffened. For a fraction of a second, the ever-present smile faltered. Above them, across Britain, ancient wards began to fail one by one, and somewhere in the dark, Voldemort smiled at news he had not yet received. They returned to Hogwarts as different people. The ruins had spoken, and the world above no longer sounded the same. Dumbledore withdrew into the archives beneath the castle, and for 3 days scarcely emerged, surrounded by scrolls so old their ink had begun to whisper. When at last he summoned Gojo, Harry, and Hermione to his office, the fire in the hearth burned blue, and every portrait on the walls had turned politely away. The archives, Dumbledore explained, told a story wizarding history had chosen to forget. Thousands of years ago, long before the founding of Hogwarts, a hidden order of scholars had studied the seams of reality itself. They had listened at the edges of the world, and had heard other worlds listening back. Their experiments were brief, their records fragmentary, but a single image repeated through their writings like a heartbeat. A man surrounded by infinite distance. Not a name, not a prophecy, a concept. A being who existed at the boundary where matter forgets how to touch. Hermione read aloud in a voice that trembled despite her efforts to steady it. The scholars had not predicted Satoru Gojo. They had predicted the shape of him, the vacancy he would one day fill. The possibility that beings might exist whose power was not magical but conceptual. Laws walking on human feet. Wizarding magic, Dumbledore said quietly, interacted with the local expressions of universal truths. Gojo, perhaps, embodied one of the truths themselves. Gojo listened without his usual smile. Something in his chest, an old, tired ache he had carried since childhood, loosened by a single, unfamiliar degree. He had always been the strongest. He had never been the understood. Harry watched him and recognized the silence. They walked together afterward along the lake and for a long while said nothing. When Harry finally spoke, it was not about war. He asked how one lived beneath a name too large to fit inside a single life. Gojo answered honestly, for perhaps the first time in years. Badly, he said. You live it badly, until you find someone who reminds you that you are still a person underneath. They laughed quietly, and the lake did not care that legends were sharing a joke on its shore. Elsewhere, Voldemort had read the same archives through stolen eyes. Where Dumbledore had found wonder, he had found architecture. If infinity was a concept rather than a spell, then it could not be broken by attacking the body it wore. It could, however, be circumvented by attacking the fabric it stood upon. His Horcruxes had already anchored him against death. Now he began to imagine anchoring something far larger, a ritual that did not target Gojo at all, but the reality around him, unmaking the ground beneath a god so that the god might have nowhere left to stand. He gathered his most trusted, and in a chapel of blackened stone began the work. At Hogwarts, philosophy became a weapon of its own. Dumbledore posed the question openly to the Order. Should limitless power remain independent of their world, a passing miracle, or should it be woven into the fragile balance the wizarding world had built across centuries? Gojo did not answer. He had never belonged anywhere long enough to know. Then the sky changed. It began as a shimmer above the astronomy tower, a wrongness in the way starlight fell. Then the lake surface trembled without wind. Then a portrait on the third floor screamed and refused to speak again. Across Britain, magical creatures froze mid-step. Somewhere in his blackened chapel, Voldemort completed the first phase of his ritual, and reality itself began to fray. Infinity, standing at the window, watched the horizon warp and did not flinch. Nothing could reach him. Nothing had ever reached him. But behind him, in the corridor, a young student stumbled and cried out as the floor beneath her briefly forgot how to be a floor, and Gojo understood, with a cold and unfamiliar clarity, that being untouchable was not the same as being enough. The world came undone slowly, which was somehow worse than if it had shattered all at once. Wards that had stood since the age of Merlin began to fail in small, humiliating ways. A village in the highlands woke to find its river flowing upward. A coastal town in Cornwall watched its lighthouse blink out of existence between one heartbeat and the next. Owls arrived at the ministry carrying letters written in ink that had begun to weep. Voldemort did not march. He did not need to. His ritual had turned the land itself into a slow, patient wound, and every hour that passed deepened it. Gojo ran. He ran in a way he had not run in years, not to fight, but to arrive. He appeared in a burning orphanage in Yorkshire and pulled 17 children out before the ceiling forgot which way was up. He appeared on a bridge in Edinburgh and held the stones together with a technique he was inventing as he used it. He appeared in a schoolyard where children had been playing an hour before, and found only silence and small shoes, and a wind that carried no birds. He was fast. He was untouchable. He was not everywhere. The first time he failed to reach someone in time, he stood very still for a long moment, and did not speak on the walk back to Hogwarts. The second time he closed his eyes and let the rain fall against infinity, so that not even the water could comfort him. By the 10th time he no longer counted. The whispers began among survivors. Some blamed Voldemort as they had always blamed Voldemort. Others, quieter, more frightened, began to blame the stranger. He had arrived, and the world had broken. Correlation was cruel arithmetic in a time of grief. Even a handful of the Order glanced at him sideways now, not with hatred, but with the exhausted arithmetic of people who needed someone to blame and had grown too tired to be careful. Harry took it worst of all. He wandered the corridors at night, muttering that if he had ended Voldemort sooner, if he had been faster, cleverer, stronger, none of this would have touched Gojo. None of this would have touched anyone. Hermione found him one dawn asleep against a suit of armor, cheeks salt-streaked, and simply sat beside him until he woke. Hermione did not break. Hermione, who had always been the smallest and the most stubborn of them, refused. She organized evacuations. She rewrote emergency protocols the ministry had abandoned. She slept 3 hours a night and drank tea that had gone cold hours before. When someone gently suggested she rest, she looked at them with eyes so tired they were almost luminous, and said that rest was a thing they would earn afterward, together or not at all. Dumbledore, older than he had ever looked, spoke to Gojo alone in the darkened great hall. Victory, he said, would not be free. It never had been. The question was not whether sacrifice would be required, but who would carry it, and whether they would carry it well. Gojo listened. For once he did not deflect with laughter. The old smile, the practiced, weightless smile, slipped from his face and did not return. Beneath it was a man who had been tired for a very long time, and who had never quite been allowed to admit it. That night, Voldemort's armies gathered. Giants moved beneath a sky that no longer trusted itself. Dementors drifted in numbers that had not been seen in living memory. Death Eaters walked at their head, and behind them came things that had no proper names, drawn out of the tears in reality like fish from a poisoned sea. They surrounded Hogwarts as the sun refused to rise on time. Inside the castle, torches burned low. Students clutched wands they were too young to hold. And Gojo stood at the highest window, blindfold gone, blue eyes open to a world that was ending, and finally understood what protection actually cost. The morning of the last battle did not come. The sky simply admitted that it was over and settled into a dim, ashen twilight that would last until the world decided what it wanted to be. Hogwarts stood beneath it like the last candle in a long, cold room, and around it gathered every soul willing to burn a little longer. The defenders came from everywhere and nowhere. Aurors in tattered robes stood beside centaurs whose flanks were marked with old scars. House elves, freed and unfree alike, sharpened kitchen knives with the seriousness of soldiers. Goblins arrived without ceremony, weapons drawn, debts forgotten for a single day. Ghosts drifted along the battlements, translucent and unafraid. Hagrid held a crossbow in one hand and a lantern in the other, and wept quietly without slowing. Gojo walked among them, and for the first time since he had arrived, he did not feel like a visitor. The armies broke against the castle in waves. Giants tore at the outer walls. Dementors poured through gaps in the wards like black water. Death Eaters advanced in disciplined lines behind creatures whose shapes hurt the eye. The reality torn by Voldemort's ritual bled into the battlefield in strange ways, gravity forgetting itself in patches, colors misbehaving, moments repeating a heartbeat out of order. Harry moved through it all with a calm he had not known he possessed. He was not the boy who had once cowered in a cupboard. He was not the reluctant hero anymore. He was simply a man, walking toward the thing that had eaten his childhood, ready at last to end it. Gojo fought at his side, not above him. That was the new thing, the thing the wizarding world would remember longest. He did not overshadow. He did not perform. He opened lanes in the chaos with surgical restraint, letting Aurors find their footing, letting Harry keep his path, catching curses on infinity so that others might survive to cast their own. Voldemort waited at the eye of his ritual, floating above the shattered courtyard, arms outstretched as reality itself bent obediently around him. He believed, truly believed, that he had solved the problem of the untouchable stranger. If the world could be rewritten, then the concept called infinity could be written out of it. Immortality was freedom. He called down across the battlefield. Limitation was the disease that had killed lesser men. Gojo answered without shouting. He said that limitation was not the disease. It was the reason love mattered. He said that anything worth protecting was made precious by the fact that it could be lost. He said that a life without end was not a life at all, only a shape refusing to be worn away. Voldemort laughed, and reality shivered with him. Then Gojo moved. He did not attack Voldemort. That was not the shape of victory. He turned toward the corrupted anchor at the heart of the ritual, the wound in the world through which Voldemort's power poured, and began to gather himself in a way he had not done in years. Positive and negative cursed energy folded against one another in his hands, and something the wizarding world had no name for began to bloom. A color that was not quite purple, a hollow that was not quite empty. It cost him. Every second of it cost him more than any battle he had ever fought. Infinity thinned around him as he poured himself into the technique. For the first time since arriving, he was mortal in the small, precious way that ordinary people were mortal. He released it. Hollow purple struck the anchor, and the wound in reality collapsed inward, unmaking itself with a silence that felt like mercy. At the same instant, Harry, wand steady, voice clear, ended the last Horcrux and turned his final spell upon Voldemort himself. The Dark Lord fell, not as a legend, but as a man who had refused too long to be one. The armies broke. The sky, hesitant, began to remember blue, but the breach in the boundary between worlds remained. Thinner now, yet still open, still whispering. Someone had to stand at that seam. Someone had to close it from the inside. Gojo turned to Harry and to Hermione, and to Dumbledore, who was already weeping without shame. He did not make a speech. He simply smiled the old smile, easy, weightless, the way he had smiled on his first evening in the Forbidden Forest. Then he stepped into the collapsing light, and the light closed gently behind him, like a door shutting on a room that had, at last, been made warm. Years passed the way years always do after wars, slowly at first, then in sudden, startling leaps. The scars on the land healed unevenly. Some villages were rebuilt stone by stone. Others were left as they were, quiet gardens of memory where children were taught to walk softly and to listen. Hogwarts opened its doors again the following autumn, the great hall filled with new students who had been too young to remember the worst of the war, and too old to forget the shape of the grief their parents still carried. Life resumed, which was itself a kind of miracle. The story of the stranger no spell could touch became, in time, less a memory and more a myth. Historians argued in dusty rooms and published careful, disagreeing books. Some claimed he had been an ancient wizard returned. Others insisted he had been a guardian from another universe, a concept given human shape. A few, quieter, suspected he had been something the language of wizards was simply not built to describe. None of them were entirely right. None of them were entirely wrong. Harry taught eventually, not immediately. He took long years first, walking places that did not require him to be anyone's savior. But when he returned to Hogwarts, it was as a professor of defense who spoke often and unfashionably about restraint. Strength, he told his students, was not measured by what you could destroy. It was measured by what you refused to. He never said Gojo's name in these lessons. He did not need to. Hermione went into the ministry and then out of it, and then back in again, dragging reform behind her like a stubborn horse. She built libraries. She protected creatures no one had bothered to protect before. She married and did not, and lived and mattered, and every so often, late at night, she would open an old notebook filled with runes she had once translated in a ruin beneath Scotland, and she would smile without knowing why. Dumbledore did not live to see all of it, but he lived long enough. He died in his chair one winter, an unread book open on his knee, and the portraits of the headmasters bowed their heads for a full day out of respect, which was more than they had ever done for anyone. The wizarding world itself changed in ways too small to legislate and too large to ignore. Scholars began to speak cautiously of realities beyond their own. Old prejudices did not vanish, but they no longer felt so certain of themselves. Children were taught from the first day that their world was one candle in a great dark room, and that other candles were burning elsewhere, and that this was a beautiful thing, and not a frightening one. Ancient magical ruins fell silent again, their voices patient, their patience infinite. The runes on their walls did not fade. They simply waited, as ruins do, for the next wanderer worthy of their attention. And somewhere, past the edge of all charted magic, in a place that was neither dimension nor dream, a faint blue light flickered in the dark. It was not bright. It was not dramatic. It was steady, the way a heartbeat is steady, patient in the way infinity is patient. Around it, the void listened. If one leaned close enough, one might have heard, threading through the silence, the quiet laughter of a man who found the whole situation, as he found most situations, mildly amusing. The camera of memory never turned quite far enough to show his face. Perhaps it never would. Perhaps that was the point. Some legends are kept alive precisely because they refuse to be finished.